Welcome to week 3 of our Reading the Bible in a Year program. I hope that you're doing well and being blessed by your time in God's Word as you continue to read through the Scriptures. This week we're sort of split with our time. We spend the first half of the week, the first 4 days, finishing up the book of Genesis. And then we spend the first 3 days starting in the book of Exodus. So concluding the book of Genesis, we're looking at the generation that followed Jacob, the third of the Old Testament fathers. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the fathers of the Old Testament. And then Joseph, who is the focus of these 12 chapters that we're reading, is the 11th son of Jacob. If you remember, he was the first son born to the woman that he actually wanted to be married to, Rachel. And then he had one more son by her, Benjamin. So in these last chapters, what we really see the focus on is God's providence in the midst of things that don't seem to be going well. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery because he was a little bit full of himself as the favored son, and he lorded it over them, so they plotted against him and sold him into slavery. That didn't go so well. He rose up actually in the first household that he served in, but then the wife of the homeowner plotted against him because he would not give in to her desires, and he ended up in jail. But from there, he ended up serving in Pharaoh's court and ultimately became second in charge of all Egypt because he was able to interpret a dream by the grace of God and tell Pharaoh what was going to be coming. And then he was able to put together a plan that would help Egypt survive during a famine that was coming. From that, his brothers, who didn't know he was still alive, come to Egypt to seek food because there's a famine where they're at, also in Canaan, and they don't recognize Joseph. And Joseph toys with them a little bit, but ultimately reveals himself to them. And then all of Jacob and his family come to live in Egypt in the area known as Goshen. But Joseph's brothers are still a little scared. They hadn't been too kind to him, and so they tell him a lie, or at least it's not recorded that it's the truth. Their father had asked Joseph to forgive his brothers. And Joseph says something that's very important that I think is indicative of everything that has happened in what we're reading in Genesis this week. He says, what you intended for evil, God worked in it for good. And it doesn't mean that every bad thing that happens God is doing intentionally, but it does mean that even in the midst of it, God is working for his greater plan and is able to see things beyond what we can see. And Joseph recognizes that and is able, even in the midst of his struggles and the difficulties that he went through, to give thanks to God for what God does despite those difficulties. And so all of Jacob's family is preserved, but there in Goshen. Jacob and Joseph both die, and that's where we leave off at the end of the book of Genesis. Exodus picks up about 400 or so years later. We're told later in the book of Exodus that when they left Egypt, it was 430 years after they had come into Egypt. So we're probably a little more than 400 years past the end of the book of Genesis when Exodus picks up. And things have changed a bit. The end of Genesis, because of Joseph's wisdom and being able to deliver Egypt from the famine, all of Jacob's family enjoys sort of a favored status in Egypt, and they are treated with great kindness. When we get to the book of Exodus, they've gone through a few rulers in Egypt. They don't quite remember what Joseph and his family had done for the Egyptians, and so they have now enslaved them. And as the nation of Israel is getting larger and larger there in the land of Goshen, Pharaoh is trying to plot to suppress their numbers so that they don't overtake them. And that's where their slavery comes in. And in the first 9 chapters that we're reading, we see the introduction of Moses. Most of us know the account of him being born at a time when what Pharaoh was doing was killing all of the male Israelites that were born for the sake of trying to weed out the population a little bit. And it might be a foreshadowing of what Herod would do to try to kill all the male children in Bethlehem in order to get the king that was born, which we just read in Sunday services as part of Epiphany. But Moses' parents wisely hide him in a basket and send him up the river, and he actually ends up in Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh's daughter finds him and decides to raise him as her own. So we see God's providence and his provision there. Moses grows up in Pharaoh's house, but recognizes that he's not an Egyptian, and so he looks out for the Israelites. Doesn't do such a great job. He gets frustrated with their treatment, and he kills an Egyptian soldier. When it's discovered what he does, he has to flee. And so he leaves to the desert to Midian. There he meets who would eventually become his wife and starts a family, becomes a shepherd in his father-in-law Jethro's house, and seems to be doing quite well until God calls him and says, you're going back to Egypt because you're going to be the one that brings my people out of Israel. Moses objects a bit because he doesn't feel qualified, but God impresses upon him and makes it clear that he's going to do this. So Moses goes down into Egypt, and despite his shortcomings, proclaims God's message to Pharaoh, who doesn't listen. And in our readings this week, we get the beginning of the plagues that God brings upon the Egyptians in order to convince Pharaoh to let them go. And you'll see a pattern develop here where God brings a plague. Pharaoh says, pray to your God and have him stop this plague and I'll let you go. Moses prays. God relents of the plague, and Pharaoh changes his mind. Multiple times that happens, actually 9 times. And it will be next week, in next week's reading, that we see the culmination of that. But it's all God's efforts to bring his people out of Egypt. And you will start to see, not in all of the plagues, but in a number of them, that God differentiates between his people and the Egyptians. The plague that he's bringing is specifically against the Egyptians. And some of them, the Israelites get caught up in it. And some of them, they do not. It's a reminder that the bad things that happen in this world, sometimes God distinguishes, but sometimes, because we live in a sinful, broken world, we get caught up in the effects, the aftermath of the sins of this world. And so we shouldn't be surprised by that. But both in the reading from Genesis and Exodus for this week, what we see is God's continued hand of provision and guidance for his people. He has made a promise, a covenant with them, and he's going to be faithful to that. But it's in his timing. There's 430 years that the Israelites were in Egypt, a number of that in which they were slaves before God brought them out. So it's all in God's timing and at his discretion. But nevertheless, God is always faithful to his promise. And so we hold on to that as we continue reading this and seeing God's faithfulness to his people.